Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, unsure if what you just experienced was a dream or something far worse? I'm Callan Thatcher, a long-haul truck driver who's seen more than my share of eerie roads and lonely nights. But there was one night, one road, that still haunts me. It started as a dream, a simple, unsettling dream that quickly spiraled into something I can barely explain. A road that shouldn't exist. Whispers in the dark, and a presence I could feel watching me. It was so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that when I woke up, I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped. The story I'm about to tell you is not for the faint-hearted, but if you're brave enough to follow me down this road, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button, because the nightmares I've encountered might just follow you too. The dream began like any other, driving down a dark, empty highway. The kind where the world seems to shrink into the narrow beam of your headlights. But this time, the road wasn't familiar. The landscape around me shifted in ways that defied logic. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches twisting in on themselves as if trying to hide something. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I could swear I heard faint whispers in the wind, like voices speaking just out of earshot. My hands tightened on the wheel as a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a dream. It was something darker, something far more dangerous. And the worst part? It felt like the road itself was watching me. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary night. I was exhausted from hours of driving, the road stretching endlessly before me. But something was off. The highway I was driving on shifted subtly, the lines on the pavement blurring, and the trees on either side seemed to lean in, as if they were alive, watching me. Then, as if in an instant, everything changed. I was no longer on a road I recognized. Instead, I found myself on a narrow, winding path that cut through a dense, suffocating fog. The air around me grew cold, unnaturally cold, and a heavy silence pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The headlights of my truck barely pierced the darkness ahead, and the world seemed to close in on me. The smell hit me first. Damp, rotten earth mixed with something metallic, like the scent of old blood. It clung to the air, thick and oppressive, seeping into the cab of my truck despite the closed windows. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to resonate around me, a vibration I could feel in my bones. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog, I heard it. Whispers. At first, they were soft, like the wind brushing through leaves, but as I continued down the road, they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking any language I could recognize, but the tone, it was filled with malice. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, but something in me wouldn't let me stop. The road pulled me in, guiding me deeper into the unknown. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to wake up, to escape, but my body didn't obey. I could feel a presence lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights, something watching me from the shadows. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. A figure, pale and gaunt, standing just out of sight, its hollow eyes fixed on me. But when I looked again, it was gone. As I drove further, the texture of the road beneath my tires changed. It wasn't asphalt anymore. It felt like gravel, but somehow softer, almost like bone fragments crunching under the weight of the truck. The whispers grew louder, circling around me, and my hands started to tremble. The air became thick with dread, a weight pressing down on my chest. I was being pulled deeper into something that felt ancient, something that didn't want me to leave. I knew in the pit of my stomach that this wasn't just a dream. It was a warning I was too terrified to understand. Ahead in the murky darkness, I saw a faint light, a dull, flickering glow. My eyes locked onto it, desperate for some kind of clarity, some escape from the overwhelming terror. But as I approached, I realized it wasn't safety I was heading toward. The light came from a single, old lamppost standing crookedly on the side of the road. Beneath it was an old wooden sign, barely legible through the fog. My heart sank as I squinted to read the faded letters. The name on the sign, I had seen it before, but I couldn't remember where. It was like something pulled from the depths of a forgotten nightmare. As I stepped out of the truck, the oppressive silence hit me like a wall. The faint hum I had heard earlier was now gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The fog clung to my body like icy fingers, making every breath feel labored as if the air itself had turned against me. The light from the lamppost flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced unnaturally on the cracked pavement. I stood there frozen, staring at the sign. The letters were barely visible, but they were enough to send a jolt of dread through my spine. End of the road. A name that seemed so absurdly fitting, yet terrifyingly literal. The whispers returned. Closer this time, sharper, like they were right next to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the fog, eyes straining to see beyond the suffocating gloom. Shapes moved in the distance, just out of reach, twisting and bending like figures caught in a grotesque dance. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the fog, but deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something watching, waiting. As I moved forward, my boots crunched against the ground, but the texture beneath my feet was wrong. It wasn't gravel. It was soft and brittle, like something old and fragile was being crushed with each step. I knelt down, running my hand along the ground, and recoiled in horror. It wasn't gravel at all. It was bone. Tiny fragments of bone littering the road as far as I could see. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to know where this road led, even though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back. Suddenly I heard something behind me, a soft shuffle, like footsteps dragging across the bone-laden ground. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, slowly, the fog parting just enough to reveal nothing. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, their movements slow, deliberate, like they were reaching for me. Panic clawed at my chest, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, frozen by the unseen terror that surrounded me. In the distance, I saw a building emerge from the fog. An old, decrepit house, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls crumbling as if it had been forgotten by time. It was the kind of place that shouldn't exist. Not here, not anywhere. But there it was, standing defiantly against the encroaching fog, daring me to approach. My instincts screamed to run, but something inside me, a sick curiosity or perhaps some deeper, darker force, pushed me toward it. As I approached the house, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could almost make out the words now, but they made no sense, a jumble of languages and voices blending into a cacophony of madness. The windows of the house flickered with faint light, as though something inside was moving, watching me. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the wood cold and damp under my touch. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. There was no turning back. I pushed the door open with a creak that echoed in the stillness, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was the same rotten, metallic scent from before, only stronger now, overwhelming. The house was dark, save for a single dim light at the end of the hall. The shadows within seemed to shift, alive in ways that defied explanation. And then, from deep within the house, I heard it. A soft, low moan, like something inhuman calling out from the depths. The fear was overwhelming, but my legs carried me forward, deeper into the house. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and every step felt like a descent into madness. Objects along the walls began to shift as I passed, chairs scraping the floor on their own, paintings warping and twisting into grotesque faces of agony. I wanted to turn and run, but I was drawn forward, as if some unseen force was pulling me deeper into the heart of the nightmare. Ahead of me, the door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, the faint light spilling out in jagged, uneven beams. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver through my body. I knew that whatever was behind that door would change everything. I pushed it open, and what I saw inside froze me in place. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. It was small, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that cast twisted shadows along the walls. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, and on it lay a single object, a figure, a porcelain doll. But this wasn't any ordinary doll. Its face was cracked, with blackened eyes that seemed to follow my every movement, and its hands were positioned unnaturally, like it was waiting for something, or someone. My chest tightened as I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The whispers I had heard before were louder now, almost deafening, surrounding me in an invisible chorus of malice. I took a cautious step toward the table, the floor creaking ominously beneath me. The air was thick, suffocating, and with each breath I felt as though something was crawling just beneath my skin. The doll's gaze was fixed on me, its lifeless eyes drilling into my soul. Yet I couldn't look away. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it, though every part of my mind screamed at me to stop. The second my fingers brushed its cold, cracked surface, everything changed. The room darkened instantly, the light bulb above me shattering with a loud pop, plunging the space into near darkness. Only the faint, ghostly glow from the cracks in the walls provided any semblance of light. And then I saw it. The doll. It moved. Its head twisted slowly to the side, and its mouth, a jagged line etched into the porcelain, began to stretch open. A sound emerged, low and guttural, like something far too ancient for words was trying to speak through it. I stumbled back, heart racing, but my body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it was almost suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My limbs refused to obey me, and it was as if the very air around me had turned solid, trapping me in place. The doll's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, revealing nothing but an endless inky void inside. The whispers I had heard before swirled around me, now forming words. Words in a language I didn't understand, but that filled me with a primal terror. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker, thicker, until they began to take shape. Out of the corners of the room, they emerged, figures, grotesque and twisted, their bodies elongated and wrong, their faces distorted into expressions of eternal agony. Their eyes were empty voids, much like the doll's, and yet I could feel their gaze burning into me. They moved toward me slowly, each step deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The air grew colder, and with every breath it felt as though my lungs were filling with ice. Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, caught in this nightmare with no way out. And then from behind me, I felt it, another presence, much closer than the others. It was cold, so cold that the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, I turned my head, terrified of what I might see. Standing directly behind me was the figure from my dream, the one I had glimpsed on the road, watching me from the shadows. But this time, it was no shadow. It was real, towering over me, its face hidden beneath a hood of darkness. I could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, against my skin. It leaned in closer, and in a voice that seemed to crawl into my mind, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The figure's hand reached out, long and skeletal, its fingers brushing against my shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of icy pain through my body, as though it was pulling the warmth, the life, out of me. My vision blurred, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The figures surrounding me closed in, their distorted faces inches from mine, and in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a dream. I wasn't going to wake up from this. Whatever this place was, it had claimed me. Desperation clawed at my chest, and in a final act of defiance, I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would all just disappear. When I opened them again, I was back in my truck, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. The world around me was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. But as I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, I froze. The time read 3:33 a.m., the exact moment I had woken from the dream before. And then, from somewhere deep in the night, I heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of those same whispers, echoing just beyond the edge of my vision. I wasn't alone. The days following that night were a blur of sleeplessness and paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it. The presence I had encountered in that dream, still lurking just beyond my consciousness. Watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a figment of my exhausted mind. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the details refused to fade. Every sound, every image, every chilling moment replayed in my head, like a movie stuck on a loop. The whispers, they hadn't left me. Even in the waking world, I could hear them faintly in the silence, like they were embedded in the very air around me. Determined to shake the lingering fear, I started to dig deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream was more than just a random creation of my subconscious. There was something familiar about that road, that house. I began searching online for anything that could explain what I had seen. Hours passed as I scoured forums, articles, and obscure websites, looking for clues. At first there was nothing, just the usual cryptic theories about dreams and nightmares. But then I found something that stopped me cold. A thread on an old, barely active forum caught my attention. The title read, "The Vanishing Road. Have you seen it too?" My heart raced as I clicked on the link. What I found inside sent a chill down my spine. There were posts from people all over the country claiming they had dreamed of the same road. A road that appeared out of nowhere, leading them to places that didn't seem to exist. The descriptions were eerily similar to what I had experienced. The fog, the oppressive silence, the shifting shadows. But what disturbed me the most were the accounts of those who had seen something on the road. Figures in the darkness, watching them from the edges of the fog. One post in particular made my blood run cold. A woman claimed she had dreamed of the road several times, each time getting closer to an old, decrepit house. She described the same bone-chilling details: the broken lamppost, the cracked pavement, the smell of decay. But what caught my attention was the date of her last post. It was 3 years ago, and there were no follow-up messages. She had stopped posting altogether, as if she had disappeared. And she wasn't the only one. Several of the people who had described similar dreams had gone silent after a few months, leaving their stories unfinished. My hands trembled as I read through the comments. Could this really be more than just a dream? Was there something out there, something real, that was drawing people into its web? The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I had experienced wasn't just a nightmare. It was a warning I had ignored. Driven by a growing sense of dread, I started to research the location from my dream. I had no name to go on, no specific landmarks, but something about the landscape had felt familiar. I remembered the old sign at the side of the road, the one that read, "End of the road." I plugged the phrase into a search engine, hoping for some kind of clue, and after hours of fruitless searching, I found it. Buried in an article from a local newspaper was a mention of a road that had been closed off for decades. It was in a small, forgotten town, miles away from any major city, a place I had never been, but the description matched perfectly. The fog-covered road, the eerie stillness, the sense of something watching from the shadows. I reached out to a few of the locals mentioned in the article, desperate for answers. One man, an elderly resident who had lived in the town his whole life, responded. His email was brief, but his message was clear. That road isn't a place you find, it finds you. And if you've seen it, it's already too late. My heart pounded in my chest as I reread his words. The weight of the truth pressed down on me like a vice. This wasn't just a dream. The road was real, and it had found me. But why? What did it want? And why had it appeared in my life now, after all these years? Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I decided to visit the town. I had to see it for myself, to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. As I drove closer to the location, that familiar feeling of being watched crept back in. The whispers, which had quieted over the past few days, began to resurface, faint but unmistakable. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I approached the area where the road should have been. When I arrived, the town looked as lifeless as I had imagined. Empty streets, dilapidated buildings, the kind of place time had forgotten. I asked around, trying to find more information about the road. Most people refused to talk about it, brushing me off with nervous glances. But one old woman, sitting outside her crumbling house, gave me a knowing look. She didn't say much, but her words chilled me to the bone. If you've seen the road, it's already taken part of you. Be careful where you go from here. That night I checked into a nearby motel, hoping to gather my thoughts. But as I lay in the dark, the whispers returned. Louder this time, more insistent, and that's when I realized the road wasn't just in my dream. It had followed me here. The moment I arrived in that forgotten town, I felt it. The oppressive weight of something unseen, something sinister. It wasn't just the decaying buildings or the silent streets that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I had been drawn there, lured by the same dark force that had appeared in my dreams. That night at the motel, as the wind howled outside my window, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the suffocating presence of something watching. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever before, filling the room with a chorus of voices that seemed to swirl around me. I knew I couldn't stay. The town felt like a trap, a place where time had stopped, and where something far darker than I could comprehend lurked beneath the surface. I decided to visit the road again, the same road that had haunted my dreams, the one I'd read about in those cryptic online threads. I needed answers, and the only way to find them was to confront whatever waited for me on that cursed path. I left the motel in the dead of night, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The road wasn't hard to find. It called to me, like a magnet pulling me toward it. As I drove, the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable, just like in my dream. The headlights of my truck barely cut through the mist, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same feeling I had experienced in the nightmare. The road stretched endlessly before me, winding through the dense forest, and soon, the familiar suffocating silence set in. No birds, no animals, no wind, just the deafening quiet. And then I saw him. Evan, the man I had contacted from the online forum. He was standing at the side of the road waiting. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he had already been consumed by whatever darkness lingered here. He climbed into my truck without a word, and we drove in silence for what felt like hours. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew what we were here to face. He had seen the road too. He had heard the whispers. As we approached the part of the road where I had seen the old house in my dream, Evan finally broke the silence. "You know this place doesn't want us to leave, right?" His voice was quiet but filled with a kind of resigned terror, like he had already accepted his fate. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was, I felt it too. That pull, that sense that the road was alive, that it had chosen us, and now it wouldn't let us go. We parked at the edge of the forest where the road seemed to disappear into the fog. I could see the faint outline of the house in the distance, the same one I had seen in my nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging us forward. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay, and every step felt like I was wading deeper into something unnatural, something malevolent. As we approached the house, I felt the ground beneath my feet soften. The same strange sensation I had experienced in my dream. The soft crunch of bones underfoot. I knelt down, running my fingers through the dirt, only to pull back in horror. It wasn't just bones. It was fragments of human skulls, tiny brittle pieces that crumbled at my touch. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep moving. We had come too far to turn back now. Evan was silent beside me, his face pale and drawn. I could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Something darker, like he had already seen what was waiting for us. He led the way, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he knew that with each step, We were sealing our fate. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty, watching eyes. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the temperature plummeting the moment we crossed the threshold. The floor creaked beneath our weight, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if the house itself was breathing, watching, waiting. The whispers became a chorus now, rising and falling like a twisted macabre song, their voices filled with malice. Objects moved around us, chairs scraping across the floor, pictures on the walls shifting on their own. The house was alive, and it didn't want us there. Evan led me deeper into the house, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on something unseen. He stopped at a door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The same door from my dream. It was slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. My heart raced as I stepped forward, the floor groaning beneath me. And I felt that same overwhelming dread that I had felt in the nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if they knew what was waiting behind that door. I pushed the door open, and inside, I saw it. The same porcelain doll from my dream, sitting in the center of the room. Its cracked face turned toward me. But this time, it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were dozens of other dolls, all with the same lifeless, hollow eyes, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. And in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. The same figure that had haunted my nightmares. The same one that had watched me from the fog. It was here, real, and it was waiting for me. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Evan's grip was tight, almost painful. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" His words sent a chill through my body because deep down I knew he was right. The road had found us, and now it wasn't going to let us go. At that moment, I realized the truth. The road had been calling us all along. It wasn't just a place. It was a trap designed to lure us in, to feed on our fear. And now that we were here, there was no escape. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the walls pulsating with a sinister life of their own. The dolls on the floor were still, but their empty, hollow eyes seemed to follow our every move. My breath hitched and the air grew heavier, thick, with a foul stench that reminded me of rot and decay. But the worst of it, the figure in the corner, stood in the shadows, a silhouette that seemed more like a void than a person, absorbing all the light around it. I couldn't make out any features, only the overwhelming sense that it wasn't human. It was something much older, darker, and hungrier. My hands were shaking as I reached for the diary on the table, an old, weathered book covered in dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling as I turned the fragile pages. Each one was filled with chilling accounts, dreams of the same road, descriptions of the same house, and stories of people who had gone missing after walking this path. The further I read, the more my stomach twisted. It wasn't just a handful of people. There were dozens of names, spanning decades, all describing the same nightmares, the same road, the same figure watching from the shadows. Evan's voice was barely a whisper behind me, his face drained of all color. This is how it ends for us, isn't it? His eyes were wide, filled with a growing terror that mirrored my own. He pointed to a symbol drawn at the bottom of one of the pages, a twisted, intricate marking that I recognized instantly. It was the same symbol I had seen in my dreams, the same one that had appeared in random places in my life since I had started down this dark path. The figure in the corner shifted, stepping forward just enough for me to see its eyes. Or rather, the voids where its eyes should have been. They were bottomless pits of blackness, pulling at my soul with an intensity that sent cold shivers down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure as it took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Suddenly the room plunged into darkness, the last flicker of light extinguished as if snuffed out by an unseen hand. The whispers grew deafening, filling my ears with a chorus of voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but instinctively knew was filled with malice. My skin crawled, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead as the air grew even colder, my breath coming out in visible puffs of vapor. I could hear Evan's ragged breathing beside me, but neither of us dared to move, and then, from the darkness, came the voice. It wasn't like the whispers. It was low, guttural, and filled with an ancient hatred that sent ice down my spine. "You came too far," it hissed, the sound curling around me like a physical presence. "Now you're mine." I felt something cold and sharp brush against the back of my neck, and I gasped, spinning around, only to find that the figure was no longer in the corner. It was behind me, its face inches from mine, though it had no features, only that endless black void where eyes should have been. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just a nightmare. The road, the house, the figure, they were all part of something much darker, much older than I could have imagined. The symbol in the diary flashed in my mind, and with a sudden, terrible clarity, I understood. The road was a lure, a trap set by this creature, this ancient being, to feed on those who stumbled upon it. Every person who had ever dreamed of the road, who had been drawn here, had been claimed. I was next. Evan's scream shattered the silence, a blood-curdling cry that sent a wave of panic through me. I turned to see him crumpled on the floor, his body convulsing as though something unseen was attacking him. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, as he tried to claw at his chest, gasping for breath. I reached for him, but something stopped me, an invisible force that held me in place, as if the house itself had decided I wasn't allowed to help him. The figure moved closer to me, its presence suffocating, its gaze, or lack thereof, fixated on me. I could feel it, deep in my bones, pulling at my very essence. It wasn't just going to take my life, it was going to take everything. My soul, my memories, my existence. I would become another name in the diary, another lost soul swallowed by the road. Desperation surged through me. I had to do something, anything to escape. My eyes darted back to the diary, to the symbol etched on the page. Somehow, I knew that symbol was the key. I didn't know how or why, but it was my only chance. With trembling hands, I grabbed a piece of broken glass from the floor and, with every ounce of strength I had left, carved the symbol into my arm. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. The figure's approach slowed, as if it could sense what I was doing. As soon as I finished, the room exploded with a deafening roar. The ground beneath me shook violently, and the walls began to crack, splitting apart like they were being ripped open from the inside. The figure let out a shriek, a sound so horrifying that it felt like it was tearing through my mind. The shadows swirled violently around us, and for a moment, I thought I was going to be swallowed by them. But then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure was gone, the whispers silenced. The house was still, but I knew it wasn't over. I looked down at the symbol carved into my arm, blood dripping from the fresh wound. It was glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie light. I had survived, for now, but the road wasn't done with me. Evan lay still on the floor, his eyes blank, his body motionless. I knew there was no saving him. The road had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before us, and I knew, deep down, that it would come for me again. When I woke up, I wasn't on the floor of that cursed house anymore. I was in a sterile hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and clean. Such a stark contrast to the decay and rot that had suffocated me only moments before. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. But everything after that final confrontation was a blur, a swirling vortex of shadow and fear that seemed too unreal to grasp. The pain in my arm was the first thing I noticed, the bandage wrapped tightly around it. The symbol I had carved into my flesh still burned beneath the gauze, though no one else could see it. The doctors asked how I had gotten here, but I had no answers. I had no memory of leaving the house. I didn't even know if I had truly escaped. But as the hours passed, something far worse began to gnaw at me. It was the whispers. They hadn't stopped. Even in the daylight, even in the supposed safety of the hospital, I could still hear them. Faint but persistent, like a distant hum just beneath the surface of reality. And there was something else, a feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the same sensation that had haunted me on the road, that had suffocated me in the house, a presence, watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the road again, the twisted fog-covered path, the shadows stretching out from the trees, and then there was the symbol. It followed me everywhere. I saw it in places it shouldn't have been, scrawled on the wall of the hospital, etched into the glass of a window, even in the reflection of my own eyes. It was like a brand, a mark that tied me to something much darker than I could ever escape. I started to research again, desperate for answers. I found more stories, more accounts of people who had seen the road, who had heard the whispers. Many of them had gone missing, never to be heard from again. And then I stumbled upon something that chilled me to the bone. A man, someone who had lived in the same town where I had found the road, had left a message, a warning. He claimed that once the road found you, it never truly let go. It might let you leave for a time, make you believe you had escaped, but it would always come back for you. It was patient, and it would wait until you were at your most vulnerable. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, with the distinct feeling that someone had been standing over my bed, watching me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. The road had marked me. It wasn't done with me. And it was only a matter of time before it would come for me again. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth just outside my bedroom door. I froze. The air around me suddenly cold, far too cold for the middle of summer. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps stopped, replaced by the faint, unmistakable sound of whispers. They were back, louder than ever, more insistent, filling the room with their sinister presence. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me in the dark. But I had no choice. As I slowly turned my head toward the door, I saw it. The symbol, glowing faintly on the wall, pulsing with a sickly light. And then, just beyond the doorframe, I saw the shadow. The same figure from the road, from the house, from my nightmares. It was here, standing in my apartment, watching me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I knew. I had never truly escaped. The road had found me again. And this time, there was no running.